Okay, I think I've covered well enough how mana works to discuss how casting a spell works. I've even talked about the way that the mana pool works to a certain degree, but in this episode I'm also going to be talking about the structure of a turn, and I'll explain a little bit more about the mana pool during that. So, let's talk about what happens when you attempt to cast a spell. Okay, so I want to cast my Utter End. So what I'm going to need to do is declare to everyone in the game that I would like to cast Utter End. I will, of course, need a target because that is a targeted spell. We'll say that they have a very nasty Tarmogoyf that I want to get rid of. I will either draw from existing mana in my mana pool, but I don't have any at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and tap these 4 lands because it costs 2 of anything, a black and a white. And now that spell is on the stack. So now I'm going to explain basically how the stack works. When you have a lot of different types of effects, it gets very complicated. But the basics are, when I put this on the stack, when I decide that I want to cast this, I put it on the stack, and everybody around the table gets the chance to respond. I also get a chance to respond once everybody has gone around the table. There's a certain situation where putting something on the stack doesn't give me a chance to respond, but I'll cover that when I talk about the turn. It's a very specific thing going on the stack, basically. So, when I do that, and once everybody's happy with what's about to happen, not necessarily happy because I'm getting rid of somebody's thing with Utter End here. Once everybody's really got nothing else to do about it, then the spell resolves. It gets its effect. However, if someone were to respond to this, then whatever's on the top of the stack, it's called the stack because you put things on top. You put effects on top of each other. Whatever is on top of that stack resolves first. And once it resolves, everybody gets a chance to respond again. And that's basically how the stack works. So, now let me bring back our old friend Lightning Bolt so that I can explain how simple reading a card really is, because it's a simpler example than Utter End. So, what Lightning Bolt does is, let's read the card to see what it does. The card says, deal 3 damage to target creature or player. What that means is, when you cast the spell, you target a creature or player. And when the spell resolves, you deal 3 damage to what you have targeted. I know, it's almost like reading the card explains it. Now, let me compare that Lightning Bolt with this Flame Slash. The Flame Slash deals more damage, but it can't hit players. There's a difference between these two on that level, but there's also a difference on when I can cast them.
The line above the box that tells us what the card does is called the type line, and it tells us what type of card it is. Our land cards have the same thing on them, and so do artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, and creatures. The main difference in the rules that we need to be aware of right now are that lands are not spells, so you don't cast them, and that instants and sorceries do not stay on the battlefield after they've gotten their effects.
But while we're on the type line, I want to go over something in there that otherwise I would have to cover in the next video, and it would really break up the flow of that video anyway. So, there are super types and there are subtypes. Super types are much like the basic in front of a basic land. They are a word that goes in front of the type of card it is that give specific rules to that card. There's one exception to that. There's a word that goes in front that isn't actually a super type, but that's really a rare example. There's only so many cards in the entire game that have it, and most of those cards don't get used very much anyway. So, next there's subtypes. Subtypes are after a dash in the type line. Basically, land, dash, mountain. Lands have those subtypes that indicate what type of mana they produce. There are a couple of other subtypes associated with lands, but most of the time they're not important. There are creature types. These are going to indicate races or classes of your creatures, and oftentimes there will be little synergies depending upon what type of creature that you have, what subtype of creature that you have, I should say. Enchantments will have auras, which will say in the text what they are able to attach to and what attaching to that creature actually does, or attaching to that permanent, I should say. And you have artifacts, which are very similar, but they pretty much only attach to creatures, and that goes with equipment. Now, then there's planeswalkers, and this is where I need to discuss that type line. Basically, planeswalkers have subtypes, and there's a rule regarding planeswalker subtypes that's very similar to the legendary supertype. So, let me just... I have this at least sort of planned out. So, if I play this legendary permanent, Athreos God of Passage, if I play this, and then later I play another Athreos God of Passage, because these are both legendary permanents that have the same name, I have to choose between these two. One of them stays on the field and the other one goes straight into my graveyard. Now, of course, that's not the only example, though. When it comes to planeswalkers, I don't really have two of the same planeswalker that have different names, so I'm just going to put the other one on screen. If I play a Sorin Solemn Visitor, and then later in the game I play a Sorin Markov, I have to choose between these two now. I have to choose which one I want to keep in play, and the other goes, guess where? Straight into my graveyard. I'll talk more about planeswalkers in the next video, mostly because I discuss a lot of things that are complicated in the next video. But what I want to discuss right now are instants and sorceries and what the difference between the two is. Sorceries are cast at a time when most other cards would be cast, whereas instants are much more flexible. Sorceries, much like planeswalkers, creatures, enchantments, equipment, artifacts, well, by definition, equipment as well. Much like those, you can only cast those when the stack is empty during your main phase. In other words, when it is your main phase, and I'm going to go over the turn structure in a minute, so don't worry about if you don't know what a main phase is yet. During your main phase, if nobody else is doing anything, you can cast a sorcery. Now, essentially, instants don't have that restriction. You can cast them during your opponent's turn. Basically, anytime you're allowed to respond. Most activated abilities will also be at instant speed, and there is one keyword that can appear on a card that is not an instant that will let it function as an instant, and that keyword is flash. I think it's very important to just go ahead and clarify that right now. Okay, so it is now the beginning of my turn, and the turn is divided into multiple phases, and some of those phases are divided into steps. The first phase is the start phase, and the first step of that is the untap step. That's what I described in the last video of me replenishing all of my resources. Now, normally, at the end of a step, I would basically be passing my opportunity to do something. I suppose that does technically happen at the untap step, although there's really no reason to do something at the end of the untap step. Basically, other people get a chance to respond, but if nobody else has a response, I don't really get a chance to respond because I already responded by passing. That is a situation where even though you put something on the stack, namely the end of a step of the turn, it doesn't really give you the chance to respond to that. So the very next thing is the upkeep. Now sometimes you'll have cards that either can or must do things during the upkeep. I don't have any of those cards right now, so my upkeep is very simple during this particular game. The next step is the draw step, and that is the part of the turn where you draw a new card into your hand. Now, Now, if this were the first turn of the game, and it was a one-on-one game, I would not draw a card, but that's clearly not the case here. So, I'm going to draw a card. Sweet. All right. So now that I've done that, we move to my main phase. And during my main phase, I get to cast spells. Anything that is a sorcery, I get to cast, as long as other people aren't in the process of responding or nothing's in the process of resolving. Nothing's on the stack, as it were. And I can also play my 1 land per turn during my main phase and perform various other tasks, including anything that would normally be an instance. So, what I'm going to do during this particular main phase is I am going to place this Plains into play. That is my land play for the turn. Then I'm going to tap this and tap this in order to cast Chief of the Edge. The spell Chief of the Edge goes on the stack. My opponent does not have a response because my opponent doesn't actually exist. So now he comes into play. He is now a creature on the field. He is a 3/2 human warrior. Now, basically, normally at this point I would go to combat, but I'm actually going to skip over that for the moment because number one, combat is complicated. Number 2, Chief of the Edge just came out this turn. When creatures come into the field, they begin by basically not being able to attack on their turn. They are not able to activate their own tap effects, and they're not able to attack on the turn that they are summoned. This is referred to as summoning sickness. Creatures that have the keyword haste are not affected by summoning sickness. Neither are artifacts, unless those artifacts are creatures, enchantments, unless those enchantments are creatures, or lands, unless those lands are creatures. So after combat, I actually get a second main phase. It doesn't mean I can play more lands, but it does mean I can play more cards if I want to. And I can in fact save any cards I was going to play during my main phase for that second main phase. But once I pass that, I move to the end phase. During the end phase, basically anything that lasts until the end of the turn goes away, and that includes damage on my creatures. I don't have any of that, so my end phase is once again very simple, and now it becomes my non-existent opponent's turn. Okay, I know this sounds very complicated, but it's really not. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and don't be afraid to watch back over the examples that I provided in this video. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk about something that is complicated. It is a part of the turn that is so complicated, I purposely skipped over it in this video. That is how complicated it is. In the next video, I am going to talk about combat.